The sun has not yet cleared the ridgeline, and already the goats will not sleep. They are leaping, spinning, butting heads with no enemy in sight, bleating into the cold highland air like something has gotten into them. Because something has. A goat herder named Kaldi stands at the edge of his flock, watching, confused, maybe a little afraid. His animals have found a shrub he has seen 100 times before. Dark green leaves, clusters of small red fruit. Nothing remarkable, until tonight. He picks one of the berries. He turns it over in his fingers. And, by the account passed down for centuries, more legend than verified record, he tastes it. Within the hour, by some versions of the story, the herder is dancing too. It is a strange place to begin the story of the most consumed beverage on earth, a hillside in the dark, a confused man, a handful of jittery goats. No empires yet, no ships, no soldiers, no money changing hands, just a plant doing what plants do. And a species about to discover it could not leave it alone. But the story does not start there. For most people, coffee is a smell in the morning and a habit by noon. Something so ordinary it barely registers as having a history at all. That assumption does not survive contact with the facts. This is a plant that helped power religious movements, reorganize the rhythm of the working day, financed insurance companies and stock exchanges, justified the colonization of entire regions, and by some economic measures, has been traded more than almost anything else grown from soil. It moved through smuggling operations, naval voyages, and empires that rose and fractured partly around who controlled it. You do not drink coffee because you simply like the taste. You drink it because, roughly 600 years ago, a string of small human decisions turned a bitter wild berry into one of the most quietly powerful commodities the world has ever produced. This is how that happened. Strip away the legend of Kaldi and the dancing goats, and what remains is geography, and geography in this story matters enormously. The coffee plant is native to the highlands of what is now Ethiopia, in a region historically known as Kaffa, where wild coffee shrubs still grow today, tangled into the forest understory rather than planted in tidy rows. For the Oromo people and other communities of the region, coffee was not first a drink at all. By many historical accounts, the cherries, or sometimes the leaves, were crushed and mixed with animal fat, then rolled into small, dense balls. Warriors and travelers carried them across long stretches of dry terrain, eating them the way a modern athlete might eat a concentrated energy bar, not for pleasure, but for endurance. That detail matters because it reframes the entire story. Coffee did not begin as comfort. It began as fuel. For an unknown number of generations, long before anyone wrote the plant's name down, it stayed almost entirely local, woven into the daily and ceremonial life of the region without traveling much beyond it. That changed when coffee crossed the narrow stretch of water separating the Horn of Africa from the Arabian Peninsula and arrived in Yemen, likely carried along established trade and pilgrimage routes sometime before the 15th century. It was here that coffee found the audience that would change its fate. The Sufis. Sufi orders practiced long nights of devotional prayer and chanting, often stretching deep into the early hours, and exhaustion was a constant obstacle to that devotion. Coffee, bitter, stimulating, easy to prepare in large batches, solved a problem these religious communities had been fighting for centuries. It let the body keep pace with the spirit. This is the first hidden system inside coffee's history, and it is easy to miss. Religious devotion, not commerce, built coffee's earliest distribution network. Sufi orders moved along trade and pilgrimage routes that stretched across the Islamic world, and coffee moved with them, monastery to mosque, city to city, carried less by merchants chasing profit than by worshippers chasing wakefulness. By the time coffee left the world of monasteries and prayer halls, it was no longer just a regional curiosity. It was about to become something far more dangerous to ignore. A pleasure. A wild berry chewed for endurance is one thing. A roasted, ground, brewed drink consumed for its taste and its social ritual is something else entirely. And the shift between the two is where coffee's real transformation begins. Sometime around the 15th century, in Yemen, someone made a discovery that would outlast every empire that later tried to control it. Roasting the coffee bean changed everything. Raw, the bean is hard, bitter, and unremarkable. Roasted, ground, and steeped in hot water, it becomes something aromatic, complex, and, crucially, repeatable, a drink rather than a survival ration. Yemen's port of Mocha became the export point for this new product, so closely associated with coffee that the city's name would eventually become a flavor descriptor in languages it had never spoken. From there, coffee did something that wild berries chewed by exhausted travelers never could. It built an institution around itself. That institution was the coffeehouse. The Arabic term for these venues, cafés, described something genuinely new in public life. A space where people gathered not for prayer, not for trade, not for a wedding or a funeral, but simply to sit, drink, talk, and listen. Coffee houses spread rapidly through Mecca, Cairo, Damascus, and Istanbul, and inside them, something almost as potent as the drink itself began circulating: conversation. Poetry was performed, games were played, political opinions were traded as freely as goods in a market. That ordinary detail, people sitting together, talking, sounds harmless. It was not always treated that way. More than once, authorities in the region grew uneasy enough about what was being said inside coffeehouses to shut them down outright, worried that a room full of caffeinated, talkative citizens was a room where dissent could brew as easily as the coffee itself. The bans rarely lasted. The demand for both the drink and the room to drink it in kept proving stronger than the institutions trying to suppress them. Coffee had stopped being a private habit. It had become a public force, and public forces, once strong enough, tend not to stay contained within the borders where they were born. By the 16th and 17th centuries, coffee was no longer a regional secret. It was an Ottoman export, a Venetian curiosity, and, soon enough, a European obsession. When coffee first reached cities like Venice, it did not arrive to universal welcome. Some clergy reportedly viewed it with suspicion precisely because of its origins in the Islamic world, with one popular legend claiming the drink was brought before Pope Clement VIII to be condemned, only for him to taste it himself and approve it instead. Historians treat that story with some skepticism, but the fact that it circulated at all says something about how unsettling this new drink seemed to European institutions used to wine and ale as the default social lubricant. The unease did not last. Within decades, coffee houses were opening across London, Paris, and Vienna, and something remarkable happened inside them. They became engines of the modern economy, almost by accident. This is the second hidden system inside coffee's story. In London especially, coffee houses were where merchants, scientists, and writers gathered to read newspapers, debate ideas, and do business sober, alert, and caffeinated, rather than drunk on the ale that had dominated public houses before. One coffeehouse, run by a man named Edward Lloyd, became the regular meeting place for shipowners and merchants discussing maritime risk. That coffeehouse gradually evolved into Lloyd's of London, today one of the most significant insurance markets in the world. Other coffee houses became informal trading floors that, over time, hardened into stock exchanges. Some were nicknamed penny universities because for the cost of a single cup, anyone could sit in on serious intellectual debate. An ordinary drink, served in an ordinary room, quietly restructured how entire economies organized risk, capital, and information. That is not a small consequence for a bitter berry from an Ethiopian hillside. But Europe's appetite for coffee ran into a serious obstacle. Yemen controlled the supply and intended to keep it that way. For centuries, the region guarded its monopoly fiercely, permitting the export of roasted or boiled beans, beans incapable of germinating, while forbidding the export of live plants or fertile seeds. If you wanted coffee, you bought it from Yemen. You did not grow your own. That monopoly held for a remarkably long time. And then, in the late 17th century, it began to break, not through war or treaty, but through smuggling. By some accounts, a pilgrim named Baba Budan strapped fertile coffee seeds to his body and carried them out of Yemen into southern India, planting the beginning of an entirely new coffee-growing region. Dutch traders separately managed to obtain live coffee plants and cultivate them in greenhouses, eventually establishing plantations on the island of Java, a name that, like mocha before it, would itself become shorthand for coffee. And in one widely repeated account, a French naval officer named Gabriel de Clou carried a single coffee seedling across the Atlantic to the Caribbean island of Martinique, reportedly sharing his own limited drinking water with the plant to keep it alive during the voyage. Whether every detail of these stories is precisely accurate is, by historians' own admission, difficult to confirm. What is not in dispute is the outcome. Within a few generations, coffee cultivation had escaped Yemen's monopoly entirely and taken root across colonial territories spanning 3 continents. A single guarded hillside crop had become a global commodity. And global commodities, once they take root in colonial soil, rarely grow without consequence. If you're finding this interesting, hit subscribe. There's a lot more like this coming. Coffee's spread across colonial territories is often told as a story of agriculture and ambition. It is incomplete without also being told as a story of coercion. As coffee cultivation expanded through the Caribbean, Latin America, and parts of Southeast Asia in the 17th and 18th centuries, it did not expand through free labor markets. On islands like Saint-Domingue, the French colony that is now Haiti, coffee became, alongside sugar, one of the colony's most valuable exports. And that value was extracted overwhelmingly through the forced labor of enslaved Africans, working under conditions historians widely describe as among the most brutal in the colonial Atlantic world. By the late 18th century, Saint-Domingue alone was producing a significant share of the world's coffee supply. It is tempting, in hindsight, to draw a straight line from that exploitation to the Haitian Revolution that followed, and the connection is real. But most historians are careful to note that the revolution's causes were layered. Sugar's profits and brutality at least matched coffee's. And the revolt was driven by a complex mix of economic exploitation, Enlightenment ideas, and the sheer scale of suffering under the colonial slave system, not coffee cultivation in isolation. The more accurate claim is narrower and arguably more disturbing. Coffee was not a bystander to one of history's most significant slave uprisings. It was one of the commodities whose profits helped finance the system that provoked it. A similar pattern, with different mechanics, played out half a world away in Dutch-controlled Java. There, colonial administrators implemented what became known as the cultuurstelsel, the cultivation system, which compelled local farmers to dedicate a portion of their land and labor to growing export crops. coffee prominent among them, often under conditions that left little room for refusal and frequently displaced food crops families depended on to survive. The system generated enormous profit for the Dutch colonial treasury. The cost was borne by the farmers compelled to grow a crop they often could not afford to drink themselves. This is the pattern worth sitting with, an everyday pleasure, brewed in kitchens and sipped in coffee houses thousands of miles away, sat on top of a supply chain that, for a significant stretch of its history, ran through forced and enslaved labor. The people drinking the coffee rarely saw the hands that picked it. That distance between the cup and the cost is not unique to coffee. But coffee was one of the commodities that helped establish the pattern. By the 19th century, that arrangement was becoming harder to sustain, not because it became less profitable, but because the world around it was beginning, slowly and unevenly, to change. By the early 20th century, coffee had a strange new problem. There was too much of it. Brazil, by then the world's dominant coffee producer by a wide margin, had planted so aggressively that periodic surges in supply began crashing global prices, devastating the same growers who had driven the boom in the first place. Starting in 1906, the Brazilian government began intervening directly, buying up surplus coffee and holding it off the market, sometimes destroying it outright, in an effort to keep prices artificially propped up. It was one of the earliest large-scale examples of a government treating an agricultural crop the way a central bank treats currency, as something to be managed, not just grown. That surplus problem found an unlikely solution 2 decades later through a Swiss chemist working on behalf of the Brazilian Coffee Institute. Tasked with finding new uses for excess beans, Max Morgenthaler developed a stable, soluble coffee powder that could be reconstituted simply by adding hot water. Nestle brought the product to market in 1938 under the name Nescafé, and the timing turned out to be extraordinary. Within a few years, the Second World War broke out, and instant coffee became a standard issue ration for soldiers needing alertness without the time or equipment to brew. An emergency surplus disposal project had accidentally created one of the most widely consumed products of the 20th century. The war's end did not end coffee's entanglement with global politics. It deepened it. As the Cold War set in, Western governments grew concerned that economic instability in coffee exporting nations across Latin America, Africa, and Asia could push struggling farmers towards Soviet-aligned movements. In 1962, the International Coffee Agreement was signed, establishing export quotas designed to stabilize prices and, not incidentally, keep producer nations economically tethered to the West. For nearly 3 decades, coffee was managed almost like a piece of diplomatic infrastructure, too strategically important to be left entirely to the open market. That arrangement collapsed in 1989 when the United States withdrew its support for the quota system. Prices, no longer artificially stabilized, crashed within months. The result, now widely referred to as the coffee crisis, pushed millions of small farmers across Latin America, Africa, and Asia into severe poverty almost overnight. A reminder that a crop grown on hillsides thousands of miles from any boardroom could still be destabilized by a policy decision made in Washington. Out of that crisis, a different kind of coffee industry began to take shape. One built less around volume and more around the idea that the story behind the bean might matter as much as the bean itself. Today, coffee is often described as the second most traded commodity in the world after oil. A claim repeated so often it has become conventional wisdom, though economists note the precise ranking depends heavily on which metric is used. What is not in dispute is the scale. An estimated 25 million smallholder farmers across dozens of countries from Brazil and Vietnam to Colombia, Ethiopia and Indonesia grow the crop that ends up in well over 2 billion cups consumed worldwide every single day. Here is the third hidden system inside coffee's story, and it is the one still operating right now. Underneath your own cup. The price farmers receive is not set by any of them. It is set on commodity exchanges in New York and London, where futures contracts are traded by people who will never see a coffee plant, based on weather forecasts, currency fluctuations, and speculation. A poor harvest season in Brazil can move prices in Kenya. A frost in one valley can determine whether a farming family in a completely different country can afford to send their children to school that year. The connection between a $3 cup at a city cafe and the few cents that may have reached the farmer who grew it remains one of the least visible supply chains in everyday consumer life. The response to that imbalance has reshaped the industry over the past 3 decades. Fair trade certification, direct trade relationships between roasters and farms, and the so-called third wave specialty coffee movement all emerged in part as attempts to shorten that distance, to make the price paid reflect something closer to the actual cost of growing the bean, and to make consumers aware that the chain even exists. Looming over all of it is a newer threat that no certification can fully solve: climate change. Arabica coffee, the species behind most specialty coffee, is notably sensitive to temperature, and several climate studies project that the land suitable for growing it could shrink substantially by mid-century if current warming trends continue. Though the exact scale of that shrinkage remains an active area of research and debate among climate scientists. Entire growing regions that have produced coffee for generations may simply become too hot to sustain it. And yet, through all of that uncertainty, the daily ritual has barely wavered. People still reach for coffee first thing in the morning, mid-afternoon, before exams, before meetings, before long drives. Not so different in function from the Oromo travelers who once chewed a handful of berries and fat to keep moving across a long stretch of dry highland. The form has changed almost beyond recognition. The underlying instinct has not changed at all. Start with a goat herder, confused, watching his animals leap in the dark. End with you, this morning, reaching for a cup without thinking twice about it. In between sits one of the strangest through lines in human history, a wild Ethiopian berry chewed for endurance by travelers crossing dry highlands, a stimulant adopted by Sufi monks fighting exhaustion through long nights of devotion. A drink so socially potent that empires alternately embraced it and tried to ban it. A commodity smuggled across oceans in defiance of monopolies. A crop whose profits helped finance some of the most brutal labor systems in colonial history, and eventually a Cold War bargaining chip stabilized by international quota agreements that most of its drinkers never knew existed. None of that history announces itself in the smell of a fresh pot brewing. That may be the most unsettling part of this story, not that coffee shaped religion, finance, empire, and exploitation, but that it did so almost invisibly, one ordinary cup at a time, across more than half a millennium. The next time you hold a cup, you are not just holding a beverage, you are holding the end point of a supply chain that runs through Ethiopian highlands, Yemeni ports, London coffeehouses, Caribbean plantations, Brazilian price wars, and a New York trading floor, compressed into something you can finish in 15 minutes without thinking about any of it. That, more than anything, is the real power coffee has always had, not the caffeine, but the quiet. Coffee built fortunes and broke empires, and it's still shaping the world you live in. If that surprised you, subscribe and tell us in the comments, what's the one detail you didn't see coming?